Good morning. I'm Mark Silverstone, Associate Professor in Presidential Studies and Chair of the Miller Center's Presidential Recordings Program. And I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the Miller Center's William C. Battle Symposium on American Diplomacy, which this year is commemorating the 20th anniversary of 9/11. For those of you who attended yesterday's sessions with Philip Zellicoe, Tom Donilon, and Richard Haas, I hope you found them stimulating and provocative. From start to finish, they provided key insights into the terrorist attacks of 9/11, its meaning in history, and its impact on U.S. foreign relations. If you didn't have a chance to tune in, you can do so via millercenter.org, as those sessions, just like all of our public sessions, are archived on our website. This morning's conversations will focus on the impact of 9/11 on America at home, as well as abroad, an impact that's been both profound and enduring. But we'll first take a more granular look at the impact of 9/11 on America and the world. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 precipitated our entrance into and our conduct of 2 wars, which themselves reshaped U.S. foreign relations and our relations with the international community, with friends and foes alike. Those wars reshuffled our nation's priorities, reoriented our focus, shifted our allocation of resources, and recast our role in the world. They also created opportunity costs that we're still trying to sort out. To help us make sense of these matters, we'll hear from a stellar panel of scholars and practitioners. Eric Edelman retired as career minister from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2009, after having served in numerous capacities, including as the U.S. ambassador to Finland and the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. From 2001 to 2005, he was principal deputy assistant for national security for Vice President Dick Cheney, and from 2005 to 2009, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He is currently, among several positions he holds, a Miller Center Practitioner Senior Fellow. Mel Leffler is Stettinius Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Virginia, a former Dean of the UVA College of Arts and Sciences, and a renowned historian of U.S. foreign relations. His books have won numerous awards, including the Bancroft Prize for A Preponderance of Power, which looks at the administration of President Harry Truman in the early Cold War. And he's currently writing about the foreign policies of the George W. Bush administration. Stephen Morrison is Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Director of its Global Health Policy Center. He served on the State Department policy planning staff in the Clinton administration and subsequently launched an HIV/AIDS task force chaired by Senators John Kerry and Bill Frist, and he is currently the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center. Mara Rudman is the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. She served in the Clinton and Obama administrations in numerous capacities, including in the Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, and as Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Moderating our conversation is Stephen Mull, the Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of Virginia. Steve has served in a range of national security positions, including most recently as Acting Undersecretary of Political Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and as the lead coordinator for the Iran Nuclear Implementation Agreement from 2015 to 2017. He has also served as U.S. Ambassador to Lithuania and as U.S. Ambassador to Poland, and he is currently a Miller Center Practitioner Senior Fellow. I'm going to hand it over to Steve, but before I do, I'm going to encourage all of you in the audience to submit questions via the Q&A function so we can have a robust debate. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and a warm good morning to our distinguished panel and to those of you watching at home. Like many of our conference participants, 9/11 found me overseas, where I was working as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia. I had just returned home from a late night at the embassy to see the images of the burning North Tower on the news, followed by the sight in real time of the second plane crashing into the South Tower. It was a horror show that only deepened through that sleepless night as the scope of what was happening became painfully clear. The next morning, we were consoled by the visits of hundreds of average Indonesians who came to the embassy to lay piles of candles and flowers at our gates. But that atmosphere of warmth and sympathy soon vanished. As Philip Zelikow mentioned yesterday, it quickly became clear that the attacks were a seminal moment in the internal conflict that was gripping and still grips Islam. 2 days after the attacks, Islamist extremist political forces in Indonesia, seeking to pressure Indonesia's new struggling democratic government, massed more than 20,000 protesters outside our embassy for a violent demonstration as our grounds were pelted with Molotov cocktails and efforts to overrun our defenses. Inside the embassy, it became instantly clear that the conduct of US foreign policy would change dramatically, though few of us suspected at the time how much it would change and how America's role in the world would change with it. And of course, few of us anticipated the far-reaching consequences, many unintended, that would result from those changes and which still color our world today. Almost overnight, my work at the embassy as DCM shifted dramatically from mediating petty interagency squabbles, fighting with Washington for more resources, and solving staffing headaches, to mobilizing the entire embassy team in support of what became known as the global war on terrorism. My morning inbox soon became filled with countless intelligence reports depicting possible threats to our mission. Nobody wanted to be surprised again, so every threat, no matter how unlikely or implausible, demanded attention and mitigation planning. The engine of US diplomacy focused its might almost exclusively on building support for the global war on terrorism by developing new intelligence sharing arrangements and law enforcement relationships, pressing allies for military and other resource commitments, and has been documented since running operations in the shadows, such as extrajudicial renditions and secret prisons in locations around the world. The face of US policy in diplomacy and development took a decidedly military overtone in the years after 9/11. Embassies around the world had their public affairs teams enhanced with military contingents, often with exponentially larger budgets than those sections had ever seen before. And they conducted so-called phase zero operations to shape the public affairs battlefield with public messaging that had a decidedly martial overtone. And ambassadors often devoted most of their diplomatic capital to winning support from allies on the battlefield of the global war on terrorism, as I did during my service as ambassador in Lithuania and Poland. 20 years later, it's important to review what we did right and what we did wrong in response to these world-changing attacks. Did we enhance the US alliance system that both Tom Donilon and Richard Haass identified yesterday as an enduring American asset? Or did we subject it to damaging strains? Did our singular focus on the global war on terrorism come with significant opportunity costs that our global adversaries exploited to our detriment, or that limited our ability to respond to newly emerging challenges? Was President Bush's post-9/11 freedom agenda the right response, and was it sustainable? Has the more military focus of our foreign policy for the past 20 years made our diplomatic muscles atrophy and constrained our ability to confront non-military challenges? In so dramatically changing our focus and sowing fear, can it be said that Al-Qaeda won? Or does the lack of a repeat of a foreign-inspired terrorist attack on the scale of 9/11 in the US indicate that we have successfully responded to the threat? We're honored to have such a distinguished and experienced panel with us today to address these important questions. As our program unfolds, as Mark mentioned, we welcome questions from the audience. Please enter them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll look forward to getting to as many of them as possible before the end of our hour. Ambassador Edelman, let's begin with you. As Mark mentioned, you were there in Vice President Cheney's office as the Bush administration responded in the devastating aftermath of 9/11. In constructing the US response, the White House had the unenviable task of balancing immediate and extremely complex operational needs and objectives with the inevitable long-term strategic dimensions of such an epical attack. 20 years on, how do you think we did?
Well, Steve, first, thank you. I'm delighted to be on this panel. It's, as you said, a very distinguished panel, and I'm glad to be reunited, if only virtually, with an old Foreign Service colleague, and I say that advisedly because I'm speaking about the length of our association as opposed to our advancing age. I think when I think back on 9/11, I spent the day, most of the day, in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center with Vice President Cheney. It's a place I'd never been before, haven't been since, thank God. But it was the bunker in the White House that was originally built in order for the president, if necessary, to conduct the continuity of US government under nuclear attack. And I thought about that a lot that day, about what it would have been like had we been dealing with that kind of issue rather than the mass casualty attack that we had. You've touched, Steve, I think, on many of the things that I think are really relevant here. I think the one thing we undoubtedly did right was to dial up our counterterrorism capabilities using the formidable ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets that we dispose of in the United States, satellites, drones, surveillance aircraft, cyber, our special forces. And as a result of that, we have done enormous damage to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS, worldwide. And I think that is one reason, not the only reason, but I think that's one reason why we have not, as you said, had another mass casualty attack on the scale of 9/11 in the ensuing 20 years. And on the 12th of September 2001, I probably would not have predicted that. Thinking about all the threat reporting that you were referring to, that you were seeing in Jakarta, obviously we were seeing it in Washington too, and there's no question that Al-Qaeda was planning additional attacks and potentially even worse attacks than what occurred on 9/11. Once we got into Afghanistan, we discovered their enormous appetite for unconventional weapons, particularly chemical weapons, the experimentation that they had done with anthrax and ricin, et cetera. I think it tends to be forgotten. There's a lot of amnesia going on, I think, as people look back 20 years, that we had a series of anthrax attacks inside the United States in the days and weeks after 9/11, and we had a false, thank God, false positive bio alert at the White House in October that suggested we'd all been exposed to a fatal dose of ricin. Turned out to be false, but it suggests, I think, the atmosphere we were operating in at the time. What I think we have done less well over time has been to, first of all, deal with the fragile, failing, and failed states that have given rise to these kinds of transnational Islamist extremist movements. and to find a sustainable footing for our counterterrorism presence around the world. I think Secretaries Carter and Mattis made some progress in that regard. Unfortunately, that progress has been overturned a bit by decisions made in both the Trump and the Biden presidencies, but we really hadn't found a kind of sustainable posture that allows us to do this in a way that is manageable and bears the costs. And we haven't clearly done a very good job of building up the partner capacity of allies. I mean, if you look at the collapse of the Afghan National Security Forces, in my view, that is a result of a replication of what we did in Vietnam, which is we trained a military to fight the way that we fight, which is with this overwhelming information dominance based on ISR, massive air power, contract logistics to keep aircraft flying and vehicles moving on the road. And when we pulled that out, they were unable to fight. It's very similar to what my distinguished predecessor in two jobs, Bob Comer, described in a famous study that he did for RAND in 1972 called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, about the mistakes we made in training the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And I think that's been a terrible shortfall of ours. And I think we've done even worse at fighting the ideological battle. And here, I think this is where your comments about the over-reliance, perhaps on military tools, is important. But I would say, as an institution in the State Department, we have not done very well on that score. Some of it's a funding issue, but a lot of it is just not having taken the ideological battle seriously, in my view. I don't think any administration, starting with the Bush administration, has taken it seriously and devoted the attention and resources it requires. We've had many of the commanding officers, General Petraeus and others, remind us that we can't kill our way out of this problem, but the defeating the ideology, which is ultimately the pathway to success, is something we've done very poorly at. And then the final comment I'll make is that I think we did have enormous opportunity costs. And I think that's largely because it's very difficult, as you know, to get the government to deal with more than one big or one and a half big things in national security policy at a time. And I think the attention that's been devoted to this over the last 20 years, starting in the late Bush administration, made us slow as a collective to see the rising challenges of a revanchist Russia and a rising China, which we hoped would be committed still to a peaceful rise, but certainly since the advent of Xi Jinping has been much more aggressive in the East China Sea, South China Sea, other places. And so we've been slow, I think, to pick up on the return of great power competition. And I think we also obviously paid opportunity costs by not paying more attention to climate and issues and global health issues. After, I think, making some progress on SARS, MERS, and Ebola under the Bush and Obama administrations, I think we, in the Trump administration, unfortunately, really lost focus on that. And I think that is something we're now paying for, although Steve has forgotten more about that than I know. So I'll leave the global health issues to him.
Thanks very much, Eric. Professor Loeffler, last year in a review of Robert Draper's book, To Start a War, you criticized Draper for downplaying the very real fear and sense of vulnerability that the Bush administration and really all of us felt in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 as a factor in the decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003. Does that mean that Al-Qaeda was successful in creating the fear that terrorists use to advance their political goals? What lessons should we learn from our responses to that fear?
Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks for including me, and thanks for reading my review as carefully as you did. I appreciate that. I would say that by catalyzing fear inside the United States, bin Laden achieved great tactical success, but suffered ultimate strategic failure, strategic defeat. So Al-Qaeda demonstrated the vulnerability of the United States. It demonstrated that it could inflict harm on the United States. As a result, it attracted a huge number of followers, and for a short period of time, greatly enhanced its stature within the jihadist Muslim world. That's what bin Laden hoped to do. But ultimately, it was a great strategic failure. Bin Laden did not really assess the American response correctly. His sanctuary in Afghanistan ended. His training camps were wiped out. His leadership ranks were decimated. He no longer had any ability to communicate with his jihadist followers around the globe. And eventually, the viability of Al-Qaeda as an organization over the next 4 or 5 years was pretty much emasculated. So it was a strategic failure for him. Although it was a strategic failure for bin Laden, it was not an overall strategic success for the United States. The American response did produce more terrorists worldwide. It generated an enormous amount of anti-Americanism, as you and Eric just enumerated, inside the Muslim world and well beyond the Muslim world. Our response, we should keep in mind, was a global war on terrorism. And the global war on terrorism had certain elements to it. The global war on terrorism included a war against terrorist groups with a global reach. The global war on terrorism was a war against states that harbored terrorists. The global war on terrorism became a war on one prospective proliferator of weapons of mass destruction, namely Iraq. So this American response, this global war on terror also seamlessly evolved, seamlessly morphed from a focus on homeland defense and national security into nation building and democracy promotion. And I would say that this response dwarfed the threat. The response overall, in my opinion, was motivated by 3 key factors: fear, power, and hubris. And I would say that the lessons are to modulate fear with confidence, discipline power with good judgment and careful process, and couple hubris with empathy. Now, let me just say a few words, a very few words about each of these. In my opinion, and I think the evidence conclusively shows, there was very good reason to fear another attack. There was reason to worry about Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Al-Qaeda did want to attack the United States, and Al-Qaeda was looking to develop or acquire weapons of mass destruction. Likewise, Saddam Hussein was a brutal tyrant who had developed, had used, and had lied about weapons of mass destructions. Although it's true that sanctions were failing, there was every reason to think that Hussein would resume his adventurism, reactivate his weapons programs, and continue his ties with many terrorist groups, if not Al-Qaeda. But the administration was too fearful. President Bush emphasized that the threat was a danger to America's way of life. That was the phrase he used. He insisted that Al-Qaeda wanted to destroy American freedom. He also said that Hussein was a threat that the United States no longer could tolerate. Now, the administration should have had more confidence in the vibrancy of American institutions. There was no existential threat. There was no threat to America's way of life. Similarly, Saddam Hussein was not an imminent threat. Even President Bush's advisors acknowledged that he was a looming threat, not an imminent threat. The administration should have had more confidence that it could contain Iraq, even if sanctions were failing. We had too much fear, too little confidence. Power translated fear into war. President Bush felt that the United States should use its power to force Saddam Hussein to open Iraq for inspections, or to force him to flee, or to overthrow him with military action. But the president also resolved that if the United States used its power to promote its security, the United States should also use its power to nurture democracy and freedom inside Iraq. There was little assessment of what that would require. There was little focus on planning for stability, reconstruction, and democracy for post-war Iraq. A global war on terror evolved into a war for democracy promotion and freedom in Iraq without systematic assessment of the costs and without careful study of the prospects for success. Power eclipsed careful process, systematic assessment, and good judgment. And this happened because hubris reinforced power. Bush was prone to saying that all humankind wanted freedom. The enemy, Bush liked to say, hated us for our freedom. Moreover, Iraqis, President Bush believed, would embrace Americans when they invaded because Iraqis wanted to be free. This hubris precluded empathy. Empathy is the capacity to see ourselves as others see us. Bush could not grasp that Al-Qaeda followers hated America, not for its freedom, but for its actions. American support of illegitimate Arab regimes, American efforts to thwart Palestinian aspirations, American responsibility for the suffering inflicted on ordinary Iraqis by sanctions. Nor did President Bush anticipate that many Iraqis would be skeptical of America's goodwill and good intentions. President Bush could not imagine that the joy of liberation would shift quickly to bitterness, disillusionment, and ultimately insurrection. So I would say that the lessons of 9/11 are to modulate fear, couple hubris with empathy, and discipline power with careful process and attention, close attention to linking means and ends. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mel. Nara Rudman, you've thought and written extensively about the appropriate role for the United States in the complex world of Middle East diplomacy. And since 9/11, that has featured an accelerated emphasis across multiple administrations on a longstanding goal of US diplomacy, of forging a concert of interest between the moderate Arab states and Israel against Islamic extremism, either in its Sunni variety or in the form of countering Iranian support of Shia militancy. That trend reached a new level in the waning days of the Trump administration with the Abraham Accords and the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, with the complicit support of Saudi Arabia. In the past 20 years, can it be said that 9/11 had a positive influence in advancing US interests in the Middle East?
Thank you, Steve, for that important question. And also thank you to Mark and to the Miller Center for putting together this important discussion and including me in it. I'm going to do my best to answer your question at the front end on whether 9/11 has had a positive influence on advancing US interests in the Middle East. I'm going to give a highly unsatisfying and very loyally response, which is to say it depends. And then I promise to do more from there. But on the it depends side, listen, aspects of the post 9/11 relationship are strong. The bond between the United States and Israel remains unbreakable, even if it's sometimes frayed at the edges. The Abraham Accords were built on the work of at least 3 administrations to foster sustainable diplomatic relations for the UAE, Bahrain, and we hope others with Israel. And yet navigating some of the fronts you mentioned, Steve, Iran and the Arab-Israeli, just for starters, in a way that produces increased stability and reduces threats from retrograde groups, is going to be a central strategic challenge for the Biden administration in the Middle East. So I want to re-envision a little bit here in terms of my goal on responding. And I will say that I hope the things I lay out, I feel like they echo from maybe a slightly different angle much of what we've just heard from Eric and Mel. So my goal is not to be attributing to 9/11 the pluses and minuses of where the United States is in the Middle East, but instead I'd like to use our post 9/11 experience in the region as a prism through which to analyze how we might better our relationships, increase opportunities to advance our interests. So I'm going to try to summarize 4 key lessons. Folks can compare how much they align with those of Mel. I think they're actually pretty close, again, from a slightly different angle. But these are my key takeaways from the administrations of Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden in terms of an approach to the Middle East. And I want at the front end give thanks to my colleagues at the Center for American Progress who've recently published on this topic and from whom I am borrowing pretty heavily here. So my first lesson is that too often the United States overestimates benefits and underestimates costs when we develop and implement policy in the region. And so a broader range of strategic challenges a broader range of strategic options for meeting the challenges that we face should be available to presidents faced with what are clearly tremendously hard decisions. To me, these kinds of strategic options should be premised on a clear understanding of realities on the ground and appreciation of the histories of those with whom we are dealing. And in the wake of 9/11 attacks, as Mel and Eric have referenced, many across our political and ideological spectrum backed the call for freedom and democracy, understandable, to counter the extremist ideas that fuel terrorist networks. But missteps, unforced errors, a lack of appreciation for the realities and histories of the places we were engaging repeatedly undermined America's well-intentioned efforts. Our efforts to promote freedom and democratic governance in the world have faltered, and freedom globally has stagnated and sadly deteriorated since 2005, and this with significant stresses on America's own democratic system, which has sadly, we've all witnessed, have risen dramatically in recent years. So we cannot afford as a country to continue to overestimate benefits and underestimate costs, particularly when we have such clear evidence of actual costs. So the question to me then is how best to develop better strategic options for our leaders. I think this leads to my second lesson, which is the United States needs to improve how we synchronize and integrate our diplomatic, military, security, and economic resources to achieve maximum effect. The United States should not promise more than it can deliver, and it should make sure that it delivers on what it promises. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach to reconstruction and stabilization. More patient, less ambitious reconstruction could ultimately prove more sustainable and more successful, certainly less expensive. And speedy, substantial levels of resources generally don't offer a pathway to success, which may seem counterintuitive, but leads to my third lesson, which is that corruption within partner governments and US operations undermines our effectiveness and credibility. When pressure is high to deliver substantial resources on a very fast timescale, It's far more difficult than it ought to be to minimize the participation of corrupt actors. And when US objectives include helping other societies to construct effective and legitimate governments, we should be extra vigilant to ensure accountability and transparency. This has been a challenge not only in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but in one form or another with virtually every country within my Middle East assistance portfolio when I was at State and at AID. In America's work with the region and with anyone's work anywhere, outcomes matter far more than outputs. And yet the two are, in my experience, often confused. And this leads to my fourth lesson, which is that America's geopolitical competition with China, Russia, and others, along with global perceptions about our power, influence, and credibility, are impacted by our outcomes in the Middle East and elsewhere. And during the 4 administrations since 9/11, the United States has too often not achieved the outcomes that we state that we're seeking, whether it's aiming to reach a negotiated peace settlement between Israelis and Palestinians, fulfilling a freedom agenda for the region, embracing the full blossom of what we thought was an Arab Spring, achieving stability in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Listen, it's not only nature that abhors a vacuum. We've witnessed repeatedly Russia and or China move in and seize advantage where the United States has withdrawn or stayed at the sidelines. We see this in real time throughout the region, not only in Afghanistan. Our commitments to those who sacrifice with and for us around the world, including in the Middle East, is in question. And the stability and credibility of our democratic system is viewed more perilously than at any time in recent memory. This is, I hope, somewhat obviously further harmed our ability to promote the values that we hold dear, that are so important and so connected directly to advancing our interests in the Middle East. And to illustrate the immediate and clear contrast with what China and Russia may offer. So what are the key lessons I would take from how we can better what's happened in the last 20 years and how we can use that to use those lessons to better relationships and increase opportunities to improve our interest in the Middle East. Just to recap, 1, develop and implement policy in the region that offers our leaders a broader range of strategic options for meeting challenges without overestimating benefits or underestimating costs. 2, with respect to our military, economic, diplomatic resources, do not promise more than we can deliver and deliver on what we promise. 3, especially when US objectives include helping other societies construct legitimate governments, ensure accountability and transparency. Corruption within partner governments and US operations undermines effectiveness and credibility. And 4, outcomes matter alongside delivering on your promises. Nothing less than our important competition with countries such as China and Russia, along with global perceptions about our power, influence, and credibility, are impacted by our follow-through on what we say, what we do, or what we commit to do. Thanks. Look forward to hearing from others, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mara. And just a reminder to our audience to please submit questions that you have for the panel through the chat box at the bottom of the screen. I'd like to turn to you, Steve Morrison. In the aftermath of 9/11, a major focus of US foreign and development policy, really until the beginning of the Trump administration, and this was, I think, shared broadly by Republicans and Democrats alike, was that helping nations deal with social, economic, and health problems should be a major ingredient in removing the appeal of terrorism at its roots. And so the US stepped up a major effort to mobilize support in the fight against HIV/AIDS and other global health threats, and in promoting education, development, and economic opportunity in those regions of the world deemed to be particularly at risk to terrorism. So can you say, looking back, was that a useful way to advance these ultimately morally right issues, or were there unintended consequences that set back these causes along the way?
Thank you, Steve. And thanks to Mark and fellow panelists, Eric, Mel, and Mara, fascinating presentations. One thing that comes across very powerfully is just how how much 9/11 impacted all of us personally. And as we hit this moment in time, how vivid all of that remains. I was sitting in my office at 1800 K Street talking to Johnny Carson on that day, the American, very legendary American diplomat, particularly for anyone who works in Africa. We walked across the mall to get to my home. He couldn't go home. It was surreal what was happening on the ground and in the air. My daughter was 5 years old in a elementary school about 3 blocks from the Capitol. We didn't know what was happening that would ultimately result in Shanksville, Flight 93, which I visited a few years later. And it was a period of profound fear that dominated this and uncertainty. A year later, CSIS had a major dinner for a broad array of our closest friends, our trustees and the like. Vice President Cheney was to be the keynote. And on that evening, had to come to us from an undisclosed remote location, which he did on that evening. But it brought home how long the threat extended, that our vice president, a year later, was still having to operate under those circumstances. On January 5th of this year, the bomber who laid the bombs at the DNC and RNC was on my block for 2.5 hours. The bombs were detected, fortunately, as was a truck loaded with Molotov cocktails and ammunition. These people are returning on September 18th to Washington, D.C. So we do have these threats to our democracy, and the Capitol and Capitol Hill and Washington institutions are magnets, whether it's Al-Qaeda or the threat from within. I'm going to say a few quick things about the HIV, concentrated overwhelmingly on the HIV program, because I think that's the most powerful legacy in a way. We can talk about education and development and strategies, but in the limited time here, let me just say that 9/11 fundamentally changed the calculation and way in which infectious diseases were thought about and acted upon. And particularly if this was being driven by the HIV pandemic at that time. There had been, prior to 9/11, some evidence of a radical shift that was underway. Vice President Gore and Ambassador Holbrooke in January of 2000 had hosted the first UN Security Council meeting dedicated to global health, dedicated to the HIV pandemic. And the National Intelligence Council had come forward with the first major analysis, looking at this as a global destabilizing phenomenon. So when President Bush decided after 9/11 to take this up, it was building on that, but it was also building on the revised national security strategy that came out in October 2002 that mentioned infectious diseases 11 times, particularly referencing HIV, but also other related infectious diseases. President Bush chose to align the power and authority of the White House solidly behind the launch of PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was announced in January 28, 2003 in the State of the Union address. There were really two topics in that address, Iraq and HIV/AIDS. And you could look back and say, we would not have had such a major initiative on infectious diseases had there not been the drive towards war in Iraq. They were twinned implicitly in a way, one very hard and one quite soft in a fashion. And this same drive was linked to the companion institution, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, that emerged as a G7 entity with very powerful and dramatic support from the Bush administration. This moment in time when these institutions, two institutions were created that have endured for 20 years and been the backbone of global health, they were driven forward at a moment of exceptional concentration of power within the presidency. Congress responded overwhelmingly in a bipartisan fashion. The American public responded in a very favorable way. And it drove very rapid change forward. There are a number of other factors that you can look to and say in retrospect, this was a ripe moment for this sort of thing to happen. The HIV pandemic was cresting and was very visible. There had been an explosion of infections, and the deaths that follow were becoming visible. The ethical argument around doing this resonated among conservative evangelicals, including within the White House itself and including President Bush himself. Industry had generated technological solutions, antiretrovirals in '96, and had begun to move towards partnerships in India and elsewhere that were going to bring mass scale and affordable prices. The G7 partners were willing to join with us in this vision and came to the table with resources and high-level leadership. And most importantly, African heads of state in East and Southern Africa saw this threat as an existential threat and welcomed the United States. And to this day, there is deep gratitude within Eastern and Southern Africa to President Bush and to the United States government. That didn't necessarily address a terrorist threat. It addressed something else. It addressed a threat of infectious diseases. 20 years later, what do we see? We see remarkable durability and longevity of these institutions. They beg the question of, are we prepared to really break the cycle of crisis and complacency and preparing for health security threats? There is a big debate right now with COVID fully upon us. Where do they fit, and do they provide platforms for us to expand our support? And that's an active debate right now, but we're blessed to have those two platforms with us right now as we make this major debate. Unintended consequences, of course, the threat fades, and the US is left holding the bag. We account for 2/3 of all dollars spent in global HIV. Our partners in Europe and elsewhere have faded, in the sense that their bilateral programs don't exist. This was an open-ended program. We didn't really define what the end state goal was going to be, and this is a far bigger problem, HIV, than in fact we're capable of solving. There's 38 million people living with HIV. There's 14 or 15 million who haven't even been tested, who are unknowing today and who are continuing to spread. So we haven't really, 20 years later, really fixed this. We've put 25 million people on life-sustaining therapy, which is a historic achievement, but we're still far distant from having a real solution to something that still does not have a vaccine or a cure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'd like to turn now to some questions from our audience. Jim Webster asks, and this one will be for you, Eric. Our exploits in the Middle East seem to mirror in some ways our efforts in Latin and South America. Where can we expect next efforts or attention to be focused?
Well, the last three administrations, going back to the Obama administration, have all in some way reprioritized the Indo-Pacific, going back to the Obama pivot or rebalance to East Asia. Certainly the Trump national security strategy prioritizes strategic competition with China, and the Biden interim strategic guidance carries much of that forward. Indeed, President Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was at least in part justified on the grounds of reallocating military resources to East Asia. Now, my concern and my fear, and this goes to a very important point that Mara made, which is when you think about strategic competition with Russia and China, you can't kind of absent the Middle East from that competition. And we see that already playing out in Afghanistan with Mullah going and meeting with Chinese officials who couldn't be bothered to meet with President Biden's climate emissary, the former Secretary of State, John Kerry. You see it playing out in the Afghan Taliban, newly installed Taliban regime, saying that China is its best friend in the world internationally, despite what China is doing to the Muslim Uyghur population in Xinjiang. So I think one of the unintended consequences of the withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to be that, number one, we're actually going to probably have to devote more military resources to counterterrorism, because over the horizon is more resource intensive than what we were doing in Afghanistan. But I think we've also, frankly, diminished our deterrent credibility in the Indo-Pacific. You could see that with the editorials in Global Times, Chinese propaganda outlet, English language propaganda outlet, which have been directed at the populations of Hong Kong and Taiwan, saying, you think the Americans are going to stand by you if we do something mean and nasty to either Hong Kong or Taiwan? Guess again, look what just happened in Afghanistan. So I think we're going to have to shore up our deterrent posture in East Asia. And the one final point that I'll make on this is to echo something that Richard Haas mentioned yesterday in the conversation that he had with Mark and with Tom Donnellan, and which I've written about with my former government colleague Bob Joseph back in April, which is the extreme danger that I think we now face in Pakistan. President Clinton famously said in 1999, after the Kargil episode, that Pakistan is the most dangerous place on earth. I think today that is absolutely right. Pakistan has been producing plutonium at a clip that is likely to make it in the near future, if it isn't already, the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It is a perpetually fragile, failing, or by some accounts already a failed state. The victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan is going to have cross-border consequences inside Pakistan, and the danger of some of those nuclear weapons falling into the hands of Islamic extremists, I think, is something that we have to take extremely seriously. And we're in a less advantageous position to deal with it now than we were a month ago.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Mel, I'd like to pass to you, if I may, a question in from Randy Flightman. How do we defeat violent Islamist ideology? If it's a conflict within the Muslim world, do we have the mindset or the credibility to win?
Well, I don't think that we have I don't think that's the right way to frame the question. That is to say, can we defeat violent Islamist ideology? I think the point is to work with governments in the region and to understand how those governments want to configure an overall effort to defeat violent Islamist ideology. I think that assuming the burden ourselves is not commensurate with a threat to ourselves that violent Islamist ideology poses. It is much more a threat to the regimes in the area, and we should listen to how those regimes, especially democratic allies and friends, want to address that problem.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mel. Mara, I'd like to pass a question to you from Sandra Durr. Obviously, in just the past week, the 9/11 has gotten a lot of attention, most specifically with the Biden administration decision to order a review of all of the classified documents that the US government possesses, many of which reflect on the role of Saudis in the 9/11 attacks. So Sandra Durr wants to know your opinion on how should we deal with the Saudi government.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Sandra. I'm going to follow up in this response on actually what Mel said in describing how to address violent Islamic extremism, and that is that dealing with governments in the region is critically important, and so being able to have a strong diplomatic relationship with the Saudis and being able to speak truth to them on a number of challenging issues, much of which, though, in my experience, just as with those you're dealing with on a personal level, is going to be more effectively delivered privately than publicly, which may not be as politically satisfactory on the home front at times, but the ability to build, or in some cases rebuild, and hold strong relationships with the leaders of countries in the region, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is one key and critically important example, is front and center for the United States being able to advance our interests in the region. So dealing with the leaders, being able to have the kind of diplomatic relationship where you can discuss hard truths in private, and assess what the best public posture is from there, but always keeping front and center what are the key interests for the United States and what's going to best serve the American people and how we move forward. And so understanding that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is challenging in a number of different ways, it is absolutely not a reason not to engage. It's just the opposite.
Thanks very much, Mara. I see we're almost out of time, but before we pass on to the next panel, I'd like to do just a quick lightning round with each of our panelists, just very, very shortly, to ask each of you, what was the most negative thing of implications for the U.S. role in the world coming from 9/11? And what was the most positive thing for the U.S. role in the world coming out of 9/11? Eric Edelman.
Well, the most positive thing was, I think, the decision of our allies to invoke for the first time ever Article 5 in the aftermath of 9/11, which I think should validate for Americans the importance of alliances. Again, the point that both Tom and Richard Haas made yesterday, it's I think one of the most important competitive advantages, strategic advantages that we have vis-a-vis our authoritarian competitors, certainly Russia and China, who have no real allies in that sense of the term. I think the worst thing is that both because of the demonstration effect of 9/11, and then some of the both unforced and inadvertent errors that Mara mentioned in her remarks, I think we've seen an incredible global rise of anti-Americanism, which I think we've not done very much really to effectively address. And it's a paradox because, as my former boss Bob Gates used to say, he said, everyone talks about all this anti-Americanism, and everywhere I go, I don't meet any anti-American governments. They all want something from the United States of America. And so I think those are the two that I would cite.
All right, thanks, Eric. Mel Leffler, very quickly.
Well, I think the greatest success is preventing another catastrophic attack inside the United States. We should never forget that. And almost everyone assumed on September 12th, and for many, many months and even years thereafter, that there would be another major attack, and there has not been. That's a major success. I think the major failure has been the erosion of our ability to rethink overall priorities during this entire period of time, and to realize how the nature of threat in the international environment has evolved, to underestimate the importance of disease and climate and great power competition. And I think that the failure to do that, and most of all, to recognize that the health and vibrancy of our democracy at home is absolutely indispensable to make it an exemplar abroad.
Thanks, Mel. Mara, and then Steve, 30 seconds each. Sorry to be so stingy with the time. Mara?
Thanks. On the success side, I'm just going to combine what Eric and Mel said, which is that I think that the ability to prevent attacks here and the working with our allies to get that done, at least certainly at the beginning stages, and the importance of Article 5. I'd say the biggest failure is the inability of our country to continue to learn the lessons that are so clear on how we can do better at advancing our key interests, working with allies to do it, and figuring out how we move forward on that front is important.
All right. Thank you, Mara. Steve, final word to you.
Thank you. I'm not going to repeat the points made about the security gains. I would say that we did make some advances in terms of thinking much more strategically about soft power alliances and objectives and investments. It was a very uneven and imperfect transition that happened, but that was a good thing. I think on the failure side is simply the burden that we have experienced in operating under two forever wars. That's simply been a disaster, I think, for us as a nation.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Well, on that down note, I want to thank all of our panelists and for joining us today with their really incredible insights, and for the audience for such great participation. Mark, let me kick it back to you.
Hey, Steve, and I want to thank you for guiding us through this important conversation, as well as thanking Eric and Mel and Mara and Stephen for your really well-considered thoughts. I know we had very little time to explore them, but I hope we can revisit, including in their constituent parts, each of those before long. That might be worth it to do in the coming years as we stretch out to think about the enduring impact of 9/11. We're now going to turn to the impact of 9/11 at home, an impact which has been both deep and widespread. For the attacks of September 11, 2001 really altered the fabric of American life, reshaping our politics, our institutions, and our priorities. And I think through its intersection with a transformed media landscape, it's reshaped what we think about our government, what we think about each other, even what we think about truth and reality itself. And as with our previous panel, we're fortunate to be able to explore these topics with really an outstanding group of practitioners and scholars and journalists. Rosa Brooks is the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and Policy and Associate Dean for Centers and Institutes at Georgetown Law. She served in the Department of State during the Clinton administration, and from 2009 to 2011 as counselor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She writes on several topics, including the role of the military in American life and its impact on policing in the United States. Timothy Rickuber is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Smith College, where he focuses on mass media, digital culture, and emotions. He's the author of Consuming Catastrophe: Mass Culture in America's Decade of Disaster, and is currently writing on the ways that digital technologies are changing how we engage with death and dying. Barbara Perry is the Gerald L. Beliles Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History Program. She's authored or edited 12 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, and civil rights and civil liberties. And she's currently writing on the political relationship between John F. Kennedy and Eleanor Roosevelt. Benjamin Whittis is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, as well as co-founder and editor-in-chief of the blog Lawfare. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a law analyst at NBC News and MSNBC, and writes on several topics, including the future of violence and detention policies. And most recently, he's published his co-authored Unmaking the Presidency: Donald Trump's War on the World's Most Powerful Office. Spencer Ackerman was supposed to have been with us this morning as well, but due to a scheduling conflict, I'm going to step in and serve as the moderator. And again, just a reminder to our audience, to pose questions for the panelists throughout the session so we can turn to them after their remarks. Barbara, I thought I'd open with you since much of what we're going to be talking about takes its leads from actions emanating from the White House in 2001 and beyond. And you're really in a remarkable position to understand these dynamics as you've spent countless hours conducting the oral histories of the George W. Bush and now Barack Obama administrations. And I'm wondering if you could comment on what stands out to you about presidential decision-making during this era and how you would characterize the impact of 9/11 on the American presidency.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to Stephanie, my dear colleagues, for putting on this amazing two-day symposium named for Ambassador Bill Battle, and to his widow, Mary Battle. We thank her as well. She's such a good friend of the Miller Center, and I'm pleased to call her a personal friend as well. It occurred to me, listening to the amazing stories yesterday and commentaries from Philip Zelikow and Tom Donnellan and Richard Haas and Mark's conversations with them, as well as our panel this morning on the direct impacts of 9/11 on foreign policy and presidents and how they create foreign policy. It's pretty obvious what the direct impacts are in the foreign policy realm. I think it's less obvious what direct impacts there might be on the presidency as an institution in the domestic realm, but let me take a stab at it since that is the question Mark posed for me. Let me give you one example, I think, of a direct impact that people probably don't think about a lot, but that's actually very important. And that is in the realm of transitions from one administration to another. It seems to me that George W. Bush really understood the fact that given 9/11 happened within a few months of his early presidency, that it was important that when he handed off the baton 8 years later to the Obama administration in the midst of another crisis, a worldwide crisis, in that case, the financial meltdown of 07, 08, and 09, that he wanted to make sure that it was as smooth a transition as possible. And I think in turn, the Obama administration did the same. I'm not sure I could say the same for the Trump administration coming in, that they were as concerned about having smooth transitions. But it is the case that that's an institutional change in the presidency and how it operates. So it's actually a positive, I think, that came from 9/11 that affects both domestic and foreign policy. I'd say another area is budgeting. People have made mention of opportunity costs and budget costs of the war on terror. It just means that presidents had less latitude in the domestic realm, in the budget area, because they had less money to work with because trillions of dollars were going into Afghanistan, into Iraq, and certainly into the global war on terror. Let me mention a positive, though, that came out as, I would say, a blip on the screen of presidents and domestic policy, and that is the blip of bipartisanship, as I call it alliteratively. And that is that we can remember that scene, I'm sure, just after the 9/11 disaster, of Republican and Democratic members of Congress standing out on the steps of the Capitol singing "God Bless America" together. And that united voice lasted a bit in the sense that, for example, you might remember as well that on the morning of 9/11, Mrs. Bush, the First Lady, Laura Bush, was up on the Hill. She was due to testify before a committee that had been convened by Senator Edward Kennedy, the Democrat from Massachusetts, and Judd Gregg, his Republican colleague in the Senate. And they were working in a bipartisan way that had started with the new president, George W. Bush, because he had worked in a bipartisan fashion for getting legislation through the Texas legislature. And so here was a bipartisan effort that resulted ultimately in No Child Left Behind. And people can have all sorts of different views about that, whether that was a positive or negative policy. But the fact was, it was a bipartisan policy. And I'll always remember Mrs. Bush standing in front of the cameras there at the Capitol with those two members of Congress, one from each party, explaining what was happening or what they knew was happening before they evacuated the Capitol for fear that one of the flights was headed towards it. And in doing the oral history of Edward Kennedy, he talks about that day and about how he took Mrs. Bush while she was waiting to be evacuated to his personal office in the Capitol and attempted to calm her. She didn't know exactly where her husband was or what was happening. Her two daughters were off at college, so she had concerns about them and their safety. And so he tried to calm her by showing her mementos from his long and illustrious life in politics. So unfortunately, that did not last very long, that concept of bipartisanship, and we see that we are reaping the whirlwind of that now. So let me talk just in the few minutes I have left about some what I would say are more indirect consequences for the presidency, partly as an institution, but by virtue of the people who have served in that office. So it seems to me that you go from the Bush administration to the Obama administration in part because of some of the failures that are already very obvious by 2008, and the fact that we are now bogged down in 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And because Senator Obama had not supported the Iraq War and Hillary Clinton had, I think right there you see an indirect impact in the sense that I believe that this was the reason, in part, that Barack Obama got the nomination of the Democratic Party over Hillary Clinton in 2008. I think it's also the reason that he wins the presidency, in part, in 2008. So we have the Obama administration come in, and now it gets more indirect, I recognize. So the path to 9/11 gets a little bit colder, but follow me on it. With Barack Obama, you get his #1 domestic policy agenda item was the Affordable Care Act. And he gets that passed, but on a strictly polarized partisan basis and through reconciliation in the Senate. Again, another indirect impact to that is the rise of the Tea Party, in addition to their response to how the government was dealing with Wall Street, how it was dealing with Main Street, and they're upset over the bailouts of the banks, for example. But in a way, Tea Party can also be seen as rising from Barack Obama's ACA policy. And then I think you have to add, sadly, the aspect of race and racism into that movement. And that culminates in the election of Donald Trump, it seems to me, and where we are now with, I believe, the insurrection of January the 6th. And so I was pleased in some way to hear the previous panel note, and particularly one of the commentators to say, yes, indeed, we go from 9/11 to January the 6th, so that now the enemy of terrorism is within. I wouldn't be true to my political science roots if I didn't leave you with a few statistics. And I think it does relate to 9/11 in the following way. And let me ask those of you who are following today, if I were to ask you this Gallup poll question that started being asked of the American people in the early 1960s, do you trust in the federal government or the government in Washington to do what is right most or all of the time? What would be your answer? Yes or no? In the early 1960s, during the Kennedy administration, 3/4 of Americans answered that yes. By 1980, after assassinations, after Vietnam, after Watergate, after another economic crisis in the late 1980s, after what was viewed as the failed presidency of Jimmy Carter, after the Iranian hostage crisis, that figure was about 25%. About 1/4 of Americans answered that question yes, that they had trust in the federal government to do the right thing most or all of the time. It even dropped to below 25% by the mid-1990s. There was a little tick upward with Ronald Reagan in the sense that it was morning again in America. People had some positivity towards him. But of course, he actually put a sort of a negative cap on that by saying in his first inaugural address that government isn't the solution to our problems, government is the problem. After 9/11, though, to the point of some bipartisanship, some rallying around the flag, rallying around the president. By the way, George W. Bush's approval rating soared up over 90% after 9/11. Over 50% of Americans answered that polling question in the affirmative. And where are we now? Fewer than 1/4 of Americans, fewer than 25%, now say that they have that kind of faith and trust in government. And so that obviously has an impact on what presidents can do in domestic policy, as we see right now with the pandemic. We can already see the dropping in the polls of President Biden, not even just on what he's doing about the pandemic, but when people are asked about his messaging on it. Is he communicating effectively about the pandemic? More people are saying yes rather than that, oh no, he's communicating effectively to us. So I think that, again, it may be a cold path, it may be very indirect, but I think I can find a thread, if I can mix my metaphors, from 9/11 to where we are this very day with presidents, the institution of the presidency, but particularly the policies that have come in the last 20 years.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. And I'd actually like to continue this thread and pose a question to Ben. I do want to give him an opportunity to talk about the evolution of the national security state under these presidencies. But since he's written on the presidency itself of late, I thought we would just continue. So Ben, how much of the Trump presidency or Trump's unmaking of the presidency do you attribute to the specific dynamics of the 9/11 era and the war on terror? Ben, I think you're muted right now.
I am.
Now we got you. There we go.
I am on the wrong microphone, which I have now fixed. Thank you. So I think the answer to your question is that some of it, although it is not the dominant feature, is attributable to post 9/11 developments. And I want to bracket this by saying that, look, the dominant feature is the personality of Donald Trump. And, there are times that we say that there are larger forces and personalities are not the dominant feature. With Donald Trump, I think actually the personality of Donald Trump is a dominant feature of key aspects of his presidency. The sense in which I do think it is attributable to the post 9/11 environment is twofold. The first is why Donald Trump was attractive to large numbers of people has a lot to do with the post 9/11 environment. And the key there is, and people think of all the divisive policy that existed in the aftermath of 9/11, from, CIA secret prisons and torture that took place there to Guantanamo, right? And we focus on the divisive aspects of it, but there was a core that was rock solid consensus across the two administrations that followed the 9/11 attacks. And the core of that was imperfect in the case of both administrations, was a robust military response overseas, what I like to think of as sort of military counterterrorism on offense, particularly in Afghanistan, but in the Obama administration, very importantly to remember, in the form of drone strikes in Pakistan based from Afghanistan. This is a very significant area of continuity between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And the second, and a lot of people on the left do not accept this, but it is true, is a liberalism domestically with respect to, it was George W. Bush that went to the Islamic Center in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, right? A sort of sense that we are not going to go crazy domestically, right? And this is there's a great deal of continuity between and consensus between the Obama administration, the Trump, sorry, how many presidents can I get wrong? The Bush administration and the Obama administration on these two rock solid points. And Donald Trump really challenged both of them. The premise of his campaign was we are going to keep Muslims out of the country. And the idea, and he he loved to talk in robust terms about smashing ISIS and whatever, but his core promise was anti-interventionist. And he was going to be the person who, if you take all the rhetoric together and you control for the noise, he was a fundamental rejection of the of many of the key premises of post 9/11 bipartisan consensus counterterrorism. And I mean, we can go into that in much greater depth if you want. What he proposed instead, and this is where I think the thesis of Susan and my book really plays into this, what he proposed instead was cult of personality around himself. I alone can fix it. And that is, if you take that bipartisan consensus, and which had significant substantive elements, and you throw it out, and you say, what we're proposing instead is me, you get to a very fundamentally challenging personal presidency, which is at the core of the sort of work that Susan and I did on Trump's challenge to the presidency itself.
Great. Certainly the Trump presidency was the occasion for a fair bit of trauma throughout the 4 years of his term, none more so than during the transition. And Barbara spoke about the importance of transitions institutionally as part of the post 9/11 period in which we're thinking about maybe what worked and what didn't work so well. That's one that didn't work so well, even with all the Biden planning that went on. There's a very different trauma, though, at the front end of this trajectory. And I want to turn to Tim now, because Tim, you've explored the impact of trauma on our public consciousness. And I'm wondering how Americans process their emotions surrounding 9/11 and how their really our responses affected our sense of what it means to be an American and the extent to which this altered media landscape that we've been living through now has affected our understanding of our togetherness, our Americanness.
Yeah, thanks. First off, I want to say thanks to the Miller Center for having me, and I'm really honored to be among all my esteemed fellow panelists. So yeah, in my book, I looked at the ways that people process the trauma of 9/11 through mass media and popular culture. The suffering of distant others has always been kind of a moral problem for spectators. And in the book, I argue that this problem was sort of resolved post 9/11 in media and pop culture anyway, by an inducement to empathize with the victims of the attacks, right? And that kind of empathy, as I talk a lot about in the book, does have its limits and blind spots. But one result of that deeply empathetic coverage of 9/11 and its victims was this overwhelming sense of national unity that Barbara and Ben have both talked about. I mean, it did quickly become a rhetorical commonplace to say how united the country was after 9/11. And that was backed up by this sort of polling that Barbara was talking about, Bush's approval rating at 92%, legislators coming together to pass the Patriot Act, supporting the Afghanistan invasion and later Iraq. And large percentages of the American public supported all of those measures. Now, I should point out that unity for unity's sake, I don't consider that necessarily good. And indeed, our post 9/11 unity didn't apply to Muslim Americans who were immediately the targets of all sorts of surveillance and harassment. And it certainly didn't extend to the hundreds of thousands of eventual victims of the global war on terror. And frankly, it would have been better if we were a little less unified in those early days, I think, on some of those key discussions or discussions that we really didn't have as a public. But nonetheless, one of the striking differences between American identity 20 years ago and today is the amount of division and distrust that we see now. Even compared to other countries, studies show that the US is more politically polarized, and that on an affective level, right? We dislike members of other parties today more than other comparable countries like Germany or Australia or Canada. So we dislike each other, and it feels like we dislike our major institutions as well, like the government and the news media. The polling that Barbara was just talking about, there was a massive uptick, a 3-decade high immediately after 9/11 in the amount of people who said that they could trust the government to do the right thing most of the time, or just about always. But by that quickly declined, and by 2007, the share of Americans saying that they could trust the government was back down to like 30%, right? And if you think about the media, similarly, polling from Gallup shows that people who trusted the news media to report the news fully, fairly, and accurately declined from a high of 54% in 2003 to 40% in 2020. So the major question, I think, is how did we get from this place of unity, of faith in our major institutions after 9/11 to a moment today of such division and distrust? And there are, of course, many reasons for that, and not all of them have to do with 9/11. But one of those reasons is certainly because the American government lied to the American people repeatedly after 9/11, right? I don't want that to fall out of the story here that we're telling. It abused the faith and trust that Americans had placed in it. And the mainstream media covering this largely fell in line with those lies, I think, or at least, helped propagate them by refusing to thoroughly investigate them. And we see the results in those polls of people starting to lose their faith in these major institutions, right? So when we wonder why today, many Americans won't wear masks or get vaccinated, or would rather try unproven medicines instead of these things, we might think back to the lies of the early war on terror, right? The rejecting and concealing of the offer of surrender by the Taliban in December 2001, Colin Powell and the aluminum tubes that supposedly meant that Iraq was on the verge of building a nuclear weapon, and the endlessly insinuated link between Saddam Hussein and bin Laden, for that matter. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 were the most consequential event of the last quarter century in the US, and they were met with these kinds of lies and manipulation. And I think we're now living with the consequences of that, right? And that sense that we were being lied to, or that we weren't getting the whole story, I really opened the door for social networking sites to begin to become major news outlets in their own right, and to kind of deputize everyday people to do that kind of reporting and analysis. One Wired article put it in 2006 that the biggest shift in the media landscape post 9/11 was, in fact, the explosion of blogs and online citizen journalism. So lots of good, of course, has come out of citizen journalism and blogs. But you also can't think of news on the internet today, right, without thinking of the vast array of conspiracy theories and alternative medicine pitches and far-right radicalization videos that circulate on platforms like Facebook and YouTube, and among others. So there's certainly many other reasons too why the mainstream news media has struggled financially in the 2 decades since 9/11. But those seeds of distrust, I think, were sown, in this period as well. Of course, there are plenty of logical objections to, that conspiracy theories and anti-vax sentiment is really only about Trumpism, right? But there are a not insignificant amount of Democrats too, who are among the people who say they will definitely not get the COVID vaccine, or still planning to wait and see before making a decision. I think it's something like 18 or 20%. And there are, a high percentage of Democrats who kind of cling to their own sorts of conspiracy theories about Russian meddling in the 2016 and 2020 elections, and who claim that, Russian malfeasance is responsible for all sorts of domestic political developments. So all I'm saying is that this kind of distrust in government, the dislike of one's political opponents, belief in conspiracy theories, these aren't solely, Republican phenomena. And moreover, as Spencer Ackerman actually wrote about in his new book, Trump's rise to power couldn't have happened without the war on terror, I think, without the kind of nativism and racism that our wars throughout the Middle East really rekindled, without the sense of humiliation engendered by an endless war that America seemingly could not win. And none of that, would have been possible without this original sin, post 9/11 America, this idea that, terrorism was a thing we could go find in the world, in the Middle East specifically, and we could defeat it, and we could come back and we could feel safe again, right? So to wrap up, I'll just point back to, I am a sociologist. There's a sociologist named Nicholas Luhmann who long ago wrote a book called Trust and Power. And, trust is, of course, a basic fact of social life. And in his book, he briefly talked about what happens to societies when trust begins to crumble, right? Luhmann remarked that social systems need mechanisms which prevent distrust from gaining the upper hand and turning into a destructive force. And among those mechanisms were what he called punishment, penance, and pardon. I'd argue that with maybe one or two exceptions, we never really saw anyone responsible for the myriad manipulations and lies of the post 9/11, media landscape receive any kind of punishment, do any sort of penance, or really even receive the kind of public pardon that would involve acknowledging some kind of wrongdoing. And I think in such extreme cases, Luhmann suggested that there was the probability of a social system being destroyed by increasing distrust among its members. And these days, at least to me, it kind of feels like that's where we're headed, or maybe even that's where we're at. But in either case, I really think that kind of distrust is one of the defining legacies of 9/11 for American identity today.
Thanks, Tim, very much for your thoughts. Rosa, I'd like to turn to you. In this matter of trust that Tim touches on is a crucial one, and in the role that it plays, particularly recently in American life. For a while, there was great trust in the U.S. military as an institution, certainly throughout the Cold War. It waned during the Vietnam and post-Vietnam era, but then after 9/11, with first of all the success of the war in Afghanistan and a seeming embrace of military iconography in American life, whether it was the flyovers of jets at sporting events or even sporting teams donning camouflage. The military seemed to have a larger role in American life than ever before, which then seemed to have an interesting effect on law enforcement and internal security measures within the United States. And since you've written extensively on this, I was wondering if you could clarify how the response to 9/11 endowed American law enforcement, or even broader swaths of American life, with this increasingly martial cast, and what the impact of these and related developments have been on civil military relations and even on civic life itself.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here. Before I say anything at all, I have to ask a really important question, since we're talking about the changes brought in by 9/11. Ben Whittis, would you have had a battle axe behind you in your Zoom screen if you were Zooming pre-9/11?
The battle axe buried in the pineapple is really more a creature of the Trump era than it is, and it's being wielded by Bob Mueller.
I was wondering.
More of a creature of the Trump era than it is a creature of the post 9/11.
Clearly, we're going to need to circle back to this before the end of the panel, because this is a provocation that we'll all need to wrestle with here. But no, Mark, that's a terrific question. I do think the valorization of the military, the sort of fetishization of all things military after 9/11 has not ended. We've seen a very slight dip in public confidence in the military in the last couple of years, but it's still extraordinarily high. Public confidence in the military, as measured by things like the annual Gallup poll on this confidence in public institutions, is still substantially higher than any other public institution. And we still see, camouflage has become part of fashion, including high fashion. Military personnel still board planes everywhere. I'm happy to say, as a military spouse, I still get my 10% Home Depot discount, which I really have done nothing to deserve, but I'm very happy about every time I have a major purchase, et cetera. That's still very much with us. I think the brief surge in esteem for law enforcement that we saw after 9/11 was maybe partly a kind of spillover from positive feelings about the military, but I think it was mostly simply the fact that so many first responders, including so many New York City police officers, were killed in 9/11. Killed doing what police officers at their best do, which is running towards danger when everybody else is running away, and being willing to put their lives on the line and sacrifice their lives in order to save others. And I think we saw that on 9/11, and after that, you had people all over the country, people in Wisconsin and Wyoming and Hawaii and Alaska and California, wearing NYPD and NYFD caps and so on for a while. I think that for the military, as I said, that fondness, indeed excessive fondness, probably uncritical fondness of the military, reluctance to question any claims made by the military, any claims made about the need for military budgets, has remained. And in a lot of ways, that's not a particularly healthy thing in a democracy. I think when it comes to law enforcement, however, a great deal of that confidence took a huge hit, in part as a result, well, very, very large part, obviously, as a result of the rising public awareness of police killings, issues of race in policing, issues of violence in policing. I do think it is accurate, absolutely, to say that during that same period, we saw the increased militarization of domestic law enforcement in many ways. Although I also think, and I'll explain this, it's a more complicated picture than we sometimes think. It is absolutely the case that the direct legacy of in particular, the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, one of the direct legacies was to lead to the creation of a lot of excess military gear. We had too many tanks, we had too many uniforms, we had body armor that we didn't need anymore, we had weapons that weren't needed by the military anymore, and so we developed a number of programs to give that surplus equipment to domestic law enforcement agencies. We also, I think, especially more recently in the last decade or so, we've seen the importation of both intelligence gathering techniques, including sort of high-tech, drone-based and other surveillance-based intelligence gathering techniques into domestic law enforcement. The advent of sort of the predictive intelligence methods into law enforcement. And as with their use in the military, these are tools, they're not policies. They can make certain policies harder or easier. I think there's been less widespread public awareness and conversation about those. There's been much, when people talk about the militarization of police, they tend to be talking about small town cops with Humvees. There's much less attention paid to the ways in which both surveillance technologies and the artificial intelligence and predictive algorithms have in many places in the US become part of ordinary crime fighting, which again has got both tremendous promise, in fact, to make policing much less violent in many ways, but it also has the real potential to be chilling and to be abused. And I think that's gotten much less attention. I also think, ironically, not all of the surplus material provision was such a bad thing, right? A lot of it, more than people I think quite realize, was things like surplus desks and filing cabinets going to police departments. And, I think sometimes that the very visible militarization in the form of surplus equipment has distracted us from thinking in a deeper way about what is the military, what do we like about it, what do we not like about it, what is and is not appropriate to import to the world of domestic law enforcement. There are ways in which I think the domestic policing could learn some quite valuable lessons from the military in terms of training and how to train more effectively, in terms of professionalization, in terms of actually internalizing. The counterterrorism is much criticized within the military, quite rightly, for all kinds of good reasons. But at the same time, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I did not mean counterterrorism. I meant to say counterinsurgency approaches, but an approach that emphasizes the establishment of government legitimacy, population protection, and the provision of services is actually an approach to the world that many big city police departments could probably do well to emulate a little bit more, quite frankly. So I actually think I don't think it is a good idea for us either to think of militarization as all good or all bad. I think like everything in the world, that there are aspects that can be good, there are aspects that have been ridiculous and terrible, there are aspects that have been just plain irrelevant. Coda for all that, I actually would just add that somewhat surprisingly to me, despite everything in the last decade, despite George Floyd, despite everything, when you look at public confidence in law enforcement domestically, it's actually still quite high. relative, it's a lot lower than militaries, but if you look at it relative to virtually every other public institution, the media, Congress, the White House, the courts, public education, I think it's next to the military. It's the institution which Americans have most confidence. So go figure. I don't know quite what that means. On your broader question of the impact of 9/11 on civil military relations, as with everything else, I think it's just been complicated. I think that we did see initially a kind of blind trust in the military. Just tell us what to do, generals, and we'll do it. I think that blind trust in elites, amongst elites, did fade, as indeed it should. We shouldn't have blind trust in anybody. We should always be asking hard questions and thinking about, well, what are the institutional incentives that different actors have to make different kinds of claims? That as the war went on and 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 on in Afghanistan, and to some extent on and on and on and on in Iraq, that turned into a lot of skepticism. And we saw that from Barack Obama, in Barack Obama's administration, with a lot of real tensions between military leaders and civilian political leaders in the White House. To some extent, we saw that with Donald Trump. He loved his generals, but he also was quite open about saying, oh, these guys just want to feather their nests here, and you can't trust them, and I alone, and then I'm here to save you, and so forth. I think it's a really tough time for civil military relations. I don't think it's a crisis. I think it's actually a tough but not unhealthy time, where the military is quite rightly asking questions within the military, within military circles, about their role, where civilian leaders are quite rightly asking questions about, when and where should we defer to the military, and when should we really not. I think that's tough. I think it's uncomfortable, but I actually don't think it's a crisis or for the most part a bad thing at all. I think that to some extent it's not just 9/11. If 9/11 was a symptom and accelerated trends that we were already seeing in terms of the sort of blurriness about what is a war, what is not a war, what is a foreign issue, what is a domestic issue, et cetera. What is a military issue, what is a law enforcement issue, and that blurriness, which is a function of real changes in technologies, real changes in cultures and forms of communication, et cetera, has really exploded, if you will, our older assumptions about civil military relations, about what is a military task, what is not a military task. So everybody, to some extent, in the last 15 years or so, has been throwing up their arms and saying, this is very confusing. What's my job, what's your job? And the fact that we don't know the answers to those questions, as I said, it's confusing and it's hard, but in many ways, it's probably a good thing that I think we're having harder and more important conversations now about civil military relations than we've had for some time.
Thanks, Rosa. In terms of talking about hard conversations or having these hard conversations, I want to go back to Ben, and Rosa, you can chip in on this as well, and think about the growth of the national security establishment in this way. We're years away from those more fevered conversations that we had about warrantless wiretapping and the aggressive use of electronic intelligence. Conversations that spoke to the rule of law and the trade-offs between privacy on the one hand and security on the other. But with domestic terrorism now on the rise and an enhanced federal effort to address it, I'm wondering whether we're likely to see these kinds of conversations once again move to the fore, or have we arrived at a quasi-consensus on how much intrusiveness we're prepared to accept in our lives?
Yes, I'll take a stab at that. And I think my answer is, perhaps a bit surprising, which is I think there's a great deal more functional consensus than the sides in the debate tend to let on. So I think the domestic terrorism side of the question is pretty easy. There's very little constitutional latitude to do a whole lot more to create structures on the domestic terrorism side that mirror the structures that we have on the international terrorism side. And so if you wanted to create a material support law, for example, for domestic terrorism, you really couldn't do it under the First Amendment. If you wanted to create a surveillance apparatus like we have for foreign-based terrorist organizations, you'd have a major league set of Fourth Amendment problems in order to do it. And so the policymaking latitude is pretty constricted. In addition, though you still have advocacy groups that have a deep-seated problem with the architecture that has been built up for NSA and FBI surveillance of stuff going on overseas. In fact, there is a consensus between the three branches of government that has been pretty stable since just before the beginning of the Obama administration. It's had fits and starts and little problems. And actually the certain Republican who had been part of the consensus ceased to be because of the Russia investigation. But these are relatively minor changes. I think the basic structure of NSA's authorities are sound and not actually going to undergo earthquakes. In addition, I will say the privacy community has found a different enemy, which is I don't want to, but if the privacy community these days is much more apt to be talking about platforms and private sector actors than they are to be talking about NSA. And that's a reflection, I think, both of the fact that there's a fair degree of institutional settlement on the public national security side of things, which is to say that in significant ways, the privacy community lost, but also that the private sector actors are a much bigger threat to the day-to-day and realization of their values. And that, if you, what actually constitutes a real privacy threat to the average American is much more likely to be, Facebook or harassment on some platform than it is likely to be the U.S. federal government. And so I think there are both political reasons for that change, and also the fact that the debate has moved because the technology and the reality of life has moved. The final point I'll make on this is that the national security apparatus itself has done a huge amount of work to, particularly post-Snowden, to be more transparent with respect to industry partners, but also the public in general. And I think it is actually hard to overstate the effects of that, it's not that the average member of the public has any idea how 702 operates or what authorities the NSA has, but I do think the degree to which the intelligence community has played in public and has engaged on a variety of issues has actually affected the way Congress thinks about it, has actually affected the way people in the press engage with it, and has reduced to some degree the temptation to certain types of conspiracy theorizing that had been rampant in 2013 and 2014. And so I would say it's actually a real success of NSA and FBI's, particularly NSA's public diplomacy. And nowhere was this more visible than in the, and of course, this had other political reasons for it, but just the degree to which a lot of people on the left and center left who would once have been horrified by the idea of government surveillance for counterintelligence purposes saw aggressive FBI investigations implicating a campaign as obviously a justified and appropriate thing in 2016, 2017, and into the Mueller investigation, I think shows, among other things, the degree to which some of the architecture, much of which predates 9/11, by the way, but some of the architecture of that we had all gotten used to talking about in the counterintelligence context, people had kind of developed a comfort level with, and to the extent that when that architecture was deployed in the service of some other national security objective, in this case, foreign counterintelligence, that seemed natural and reasonable to a lot of people, although there was an obvious partisan valence to whom it seemed reasonable to.
Sure. I want to get to an audience question or two, and here's one that's really for everybody. As we now reflect on the end of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, is the American public's increased wariness of potential future military engagement here to stay? And might there be an opening for an increasingly rare bipartisan agreement on the need for war powers reform? And I would just reference the work of Congress recently, the House, but also the Senate Foreign Relations Committee regarding the repeal of the 2002 AUMF, as well as the one from 1991. But that's really for everybody.
Rosa, get us started.
I'm cynical. I'm cynical, right? I mean, there's still that 2001 AUMF hanging around out there.
Right.
I think it's proven administration after administration has found it a little too convenient to work very hard to get rid of it, although it has been criticized roundly, certainly by Barack Obama, by now President Biden. And I think that although nobody likes it in Congress, the reasons that the different parties dislike it are opposite, which makes it difficult to actually get rid of it or change it in meaningful ways. I also think in some ways that the problem is not that we don't have an adequate legal framework to restrain the executive. The problem is that we have had successive executive branches willing to play games with language to get around compliance, and we have had successive Congresses willing to let them do it, quite frankly. I mean, this is obviously a point I think we've probably all made time and again. Law is only as useful as our willingness to take it seriously and comply by it. And changing the language of law will not make any difference if neither the president, whoever that happens to be at any given time, nor Congress actually cares about the spirit of it. The irony, when we look at the 2001 AUMF, not the 2002 one, the one that essentially has been used as carte blanche by successive administrations to use force all over the globe against a very wide range of actors, most of whom had nothing whatsoever, increasingly, to do with the 9/11 attacks, is that it was actually drafted in an effort to narrow the executive power. The first proposals that came from the Bush administration were really open-ended, and the limitations that we see in that language, and I don't have it in front of me, but if folks look it up, it's very specific to taking action for preventive purposes against those states, actors, et cetera, with responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. And that was viewed understandably as pretty narrow. It wasn't saying, oh, go get anybody who you don't like. It was saying, go get people to prevent further attacks against the United States by the same actors who had responsibility for 9/11. And yet look what it's become. So I think that is an object lesson in the limitations of law when you do not have the political will.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Rosa and I have more than a decade of battle scars of arguments on this subject and engagement with this subject. And I actually disagree with some aspects of what she just said. That said, I share her cynicism about the likelihood of change. And the simple reason is that it is to Congress's advantage to have the president simultaneously enabled and not with recent legislation. And that's because under the current 2001 AUMF, Congress can take credit for any successes and they can not shoulder blame for any failures. And that is a very convenient position for the legislature to be in. There are a small number of honorable exceptions to this, particularly Senator Tim Kaine, who has been engaged in a long-term, very earnest effort to think about what serious AUMF reform would look like. Most of his colleagues in both chambers have no actual interest in that. They have an interest in going through certain motions to appear like they are seeking it and actually leaving the framework in place, because the framework sloughs off the entire responsibility onto the executive branch.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Tim, did you want to go and add to that?
Well, I guess from a sort of public perception perspective, I do think maybe things have changed there. I don't think, the legal authority, the dubious legal authority for all these little, skirmishes and operations is still in place. I don't think you'll see the kind of rally around the flag effect for some sort of large scale military action anymore. If you recall, after 9/11, the big cover story on Newsweek was, why do they hate us, right? The idea that it was inconceivable that anyone could view America as not this sort of like universal force for good in the world, and no one is under any illusions about that sort of thing now. I mean, I don't think that sort of innocence or naivete is going to be behind any kind of public support for a larger effort like we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Barbara, did you want to get in as well? I wanted to give you an opportunity.
That's okay, Mark. We have a few minutes left. I'll let you pose another audience question.
Yeah, well, you're right. We do have very little time left. So we'll kind of go to a lightning round now as we close up. And, it's the big question, the historical question. We're 50 years out and looking back on this era of American history, which presupposes the notion that this era of American history is over, because it's hard to know what the tail will look like. And even though, let's say, war in Afghanistan has ended, it doesn't necessarily mean that forever war has ended, as it takes different kinds of forms. But putting us further into the future, what is it that stands out as perhaps some of the more consequential developments from this era that will linger and endure and continue to affect the shape of American life?
Well, I will go with that one for just a bit, Mark, and that is to say I so agree with Ben's comments earlier on about the personality of presidents, and what Stephanie George Gakis Abbott and I have written on in a book that the Miller Center published called The Presidency: Constitutional Crossroads. And one of the crossroads for presidents was this increasing personalization of the office that really begins back in the early 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who had this ability and the technology by that time and the travel ability of that time to reach people directly. And unfortunately, I think particularly with 9/11, and as Ben explained it, what came from that in these 20 years is what I call the demagogic presidency. So not only presidents reaching people directly, but with the last president reaching to them reaching to the people and appealing to their base instincts, which is the very definition of a demagogue. So my hope that when we come back in 30 years, 50 years on, will be that we actually still have a democratic republic that we can be talking about.
Tim, Rosa, Ben.
I mean, I guess the thing that jumps out for me is that we spent 20 years doing this and not thinking too much about climate. I know people in the last panel said the same thing. But yeah, that's the one that hurts the most, maybe. Yeah,
the opportunity cost.
I would add that I think what will stay with us and what is most troubling long-term is the invisible stuff, the ways in which some of the post 9/11 practices have trickled down into ordinary practice, whether it's often unmonitored, under-regulated use of surveillance and predictive technologies by law enforcement, or whether it's practices such as a greater tolerance of secret proceedings or the use of the state secret doctrine in domestic court proceedings that really have nothing to do with national security in any direct way, or even sometimes really any obvious indirect way. I worry more about that there are a lot of things we have come to accept and take for granted, and a lot of other things we don't even realize have sort of snuck into our ordinary practices, and we're going to be living with them for generations.
Wow, I want to end on a more optimistic note than at least two of my co-panelists. I think there is an extraordinary accomplishment over the last 20 years that we should not lose sight of. And that is, we were confronted on 9/11 with the question of whether you could protect this country in a fashion consistent with its being an open democratic society from catastrophic terrorist attacks that included, people talk about the World Trade Center, but let's remember a plane slammed into the Pentagon. Last year we voted out a president. So for all the talk about, and I share Barbara's concern about the future ability to retain a democratic republic in an era of demagoguery, and that's, I just wrote a book about that. So I share that concern. I also think we went through 20 years in which the society fundamentally retained its liberal character, retained its democratic character, and prevented, really dismantled a lot of terrorist architecture overseas. People forget about how successful that was in talking about the Afghanistan war as a failure, which its later stages certainly were. We protected the country and retained its liberal democratic character over a long period of time quite successly. And we should not lose, that was not a foregone conclusion that would be able to happen. And we did that. There were many failures along the way. I think it is an extraordinary accomplishment that we should not forget as we gloomily reflect on how things could have been better than they were.
Ben, thanks for ending on that uplifting note. And thanks really to all of you for a very engaging conversation. And as I mentioned at the end of the last panel, it's a conversation whose constituent parts I hope we can return to in the near future. In closing this two-day symposium on the legacy of 9/11, I'd once again like to thank the Battle family, Barry Battle and her late husband, Ambassador William C. Battle, for their generous support of this annual event that allows us to explore topics of vital interest to America and its role in the world. I'd also like to thank Stephanie Georgakis Abbott and Alfred Reeves IV, my Miller Center collaborators in producing this event, Woody Sherman, Mike Greco, Howard Witt, and the whole Miller Center IT and communications team for pulling it together so well. Bill Antholis, Director and CEO of the Miller Center, for his indispensable aid in its design and agenda. And you, our Miller Center audience and friends, without whom none of this would be possible. We wish you an enjoyable rest of the day and weekend, one that'll no doubt include more reflection on the events of 20 years ago and their enduring legacy. We hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.